father, a man named Thomas, had worked tirelessly all his life, sacrificing dreams and comfort to ensure his children could chase theirs. His hands were weathered from years of labor, and his heart was worn from the relentless rhythm of providing. With retirement nearing, Thomas envisioned a tranquil life, one where he'd be close to his children, basking in the warmth of familial bonds. As his retirement day approached, Thomas made a monumental decision. He sold his house, packed his belongings, and moved into a cozy house just down the street from his children's. He imagined mornings filled with shared breakfasts, afternoons of laughter, and evenings with family dinners. It was a vision of peace and joy, a reward for decades of hard work. In the beginning, everything seemed perfect. The proximity meant impromptu visits and easy access to his children's lives. Thomas felt a sense of fulfillment, thinking he had found the ultimate happiness in being so near his loved ones. But as weeks turned into months, the serene picture began to crack. Thomas's son, Jack, who had always been a beacon of ambition, found himself increasingly overwhelmed. The demands of his career and young family left him with little time or energy for his father. What Thomas had hoped would be moments of shared happiness became brief, hurried visits and fleeting conversations. His daughter, Emily, was caught in a similar whirlwind of responsibilities. The more Thomas tried to bridge the gap, the more he felt like an intrusion rather than a part of their lives. His once cherished mornings of companionship turned into quiet breakfasts alone. His afternoons, once filled with the promise of family time, became solitary walks. The evenings, rather than being warm with laughter, were spent in an empty house, the silence growing louder as days went by. Thomas began to understand the essence of Stoic wisdom, an acceptance of what is and the control over one's own responses to it. The Stoics taught that true contentment comes not from external circumstances, but from within. By focusing on what he could control, his own actions and attitudes, Thomas began to find solace. He took up new hobbies, volunteered in the community, and forged new friendships. He realized that the proximity he had sought had become a source of discomfort, not joy. The real connection with his children didn't come from being physically close, but from understanding and accepting the natural flow of their lives. His presence, though well-intentioned, had inadvertently added pressure to their already busy lives. Thomas learned to let go of expectations and embrace the freedom of his own space. His relationships with his children improved as he gave them room to breathe. They could now come to him with renewed enthusiasm, and the visits became genuine, filled with love rather than obligation. Through this journey, Thomas discovered that living close to his children was not the key to a fulfilling old age. Instead, it was about nurturing his own happiness and allowing his children to live their lives without the weight of constant proximity. In embracing Stoic principles, Thomas found that true fulfillment comes from within, not from clinging to the idealized vision of closeness. His story is a powerful testament to the Stoic belief that happiness is found in accepting what we cannot change and focusing on what we can, our own actions and responses. Today, we're exploring a topic that's both thought-provoking and deeply relevant: why living close to your children in old age could be the biggest mistake of your life. You might think that moving closer to your children in retirement will bring you the joy and companionship you've always dreamed of. However, this well-intentioned plan could backfire, leading to unexpected challenges and disappointments. Stay tuned and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more insights. Let's delve in. Emily, a 70-year-old widow, decided to move in with her daughter. After the death of her husband, the thought of Lucia being close to her grandchildren and helping them with the house made her heart flutter. Who wouldn't want to live surrounded by the people they love as they get older? Emily felt like she had won the lottery. Her days were filled with childlike laughter, the delicious smells of the kitchen, and the comforting feeling of being useful. That's the life, she thought as she prepared breakfast for her grandchildren at her daughter Lucia's house. It was a paradise where generations coexisted. She spent the mornings eating French toast and telling stories. In the afternoons, Emily enjoyed helping little kids with their homework. Emily remembered her days as a teacher. "Grandma, can you help me with math?" she asked little Matto, and her heart melted. And a recent study from Stanford University found that intergenerational coexistence can boost grandparents' happiness and life goals, and Emily experienced it firsthand. Emily felt more energized than ever, as if she had discovered the fountain of life. There's a youthfulness in the smiles of her grandchildren, but you know, the things they say about things that seem too good to be true, sometimes they are. And from here, our story takes an unexpected turn. One afternoon, as Emily was preparing dinner, she heard Lucia's phone call. "It's a blessing. We don't know what we would do without her." Emily felt a wave of pride, but also a small pang of concern she couldn't identify. Perhaps the philosopher Epictetus once said, "It's not that we don't have time, we have time." Emily felt every moment of the day was busy. Where did the quiet time go to read a good book or just stare out the window? Days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, and the routine was established. Breakfast, homework, lunch, spending more time at home, work, dinner. Emily found herself on the way back to her old apartment, about the freedom to decide what to do with her time, but scolded herself. How could I be so ungrateful? I have everything I always wanted to spend my Sunday mornings making Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes. Because, Emily said, she couldn't remember the last time she slept in or the last time she went out, spending time with friends without worrying about whether she'd make it in time for dinner. Psychologist Erik Erikson spoke about the importance of maintaining one's independence as one ages, but Emily felt that her own independence had been diluted by a mixture of family love and unspoken promises. As she put her kids to bed, Emily sat on the porch, gazing at the stars and wondering if this was really what I wanted for the rest of my life. The question hung unanswered, like a balloon lost in the night sky. Poet Robert Frost wrote, "Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one, Emily took the one less traveled, wondering if she'd chosen the right one or if she'd lost her way in her desire to be the perfect grandmother." Before you continue, if you think these videos are worthwhile, subscribe and click the bell to get updates. Emily noticed subtle changes in her daily life. What started as occasional visits to look after her grandchildren grew into constant responsibility. Suddenly she was changing diapers, preparing bottles and chasing little whirls of energy. A familiar sound. You are not alone. Epictetus once said that time does not stand still, neither does life nor boy. Mrs. Emily began to feel that the words were now true, as her days, once filled with social activities and time for herself, were now completely filled with the needs of her children and grandchildren. But guess what happened? The strangest thing is that, although Mrs. Emily never complained like many grandmothers and felt that it was her duty to help her family, fatigue began to accumulate, and with it a sense of loss. She could not explain that this is where the famous slave grandmother syndrome comes into play. No, it is not the name of the new series on Netflix, but it could well be this of Dr. The term coined by Antonio Guaro describes the mental and physical strain that grandmothers experience when they take on an unpaid caregiving role. On the one hand, you love your grandchildren dearly and enjoy every moment with them. On the other hand, you feel like they are yours. While changing a diaper, life slips through your fingers. It's like trying to hug a cactus. beautiful but painful. Research shows that this system can have a devastating effect on the mental health of grandmothers. Lack of recognition, physical fatigue, and loss of personal freedom can lead to depression and anxiety. It's like running a never-ending marathon, but there's no one waiting with a medal at the end. Lady Emily began to experience these symptoms and felt increasingly tired, but told herself it was normal. It was part of being a grandmother. But Lady Emily began to experience these symptoms. Is it really normal to sacrifice your own happiness for the happiness of others? Spoiler alert, it's not. Psychologist Carol Gilligan talks about the ethics of care and how women in particular tend to prioritize the needs of others over their own happiness. Lady Emily experienced this theory firsthand. She sacrificed her time, sacrificed her energy, and became oblivious to her own happiness as the days went by. Lady Emily increasingly looked out the window, longing for the independence she once had. She remembered the days when she could go out for coffee with friends without even asking permission. In hindsight, these trips seemed like an unaffordable luxury, but isn't it ironic? Lady Emily grew closer to her children for companionship and intimacy, but now she feels more lonely than ever. As the writer Paul Tao once said, "Loneliness begins with loneliness." The family says that maybe she was right, because Mrs. Emily's story takes an unexpected turn. What begins as a dream of family togetherness becomes a silent nightmare. Have you ever wondered how decisions made out of love can lead us down paths we never imagined? Lucia, Mrs. Emily's daughter, begins to show her true colors. One day, as Mrs. Emily is preparing lunch, Lucia comes into the kitchen with a frown on her face. "How many times have I told you, Mom, that my children don't like onions? Why do you force them to do something?" Criticisms rain down on Mrs. Emily like buckets of cold water. This case is not unique. Little by little, suggestions turn into commands, advice into accusations. Mrs. Emily feels that her voices are being silenced and her freedom is being restricted. This may sound familiar, and you may have experienced something of it yourself. Erik Erikson, the psychologist famous for his theory of psychosocial development, warns about the importance of maintaining autonomy even in old age, saying that loss of autonomy can lead to identity crises and feelings of despair. Ironically, by turning to loved ones for support, we end up losing something as important as who we are. Mrs. Emily is beginning to feel the weight of this reality. Her days, once filled with projects and dreams, are now less focused on caring for her grandchildren and following directions. Where was the woman who had planned to travel and learn new skills? A University of Michigan study found that older adults who maintain their independence report higher levels of life satisfaction. Surprisingly, not much more satisfaction when someone thinks about how they feel in every aspect of it. Every time in our lives someone says, "You should do it this way," or "Why don't you do it as I say?" frustration grows in Mrs. Emily's heart. There's a slight resentment in your self-esteem, and this uninvited guest begins to rage. One night after a particularly difficult day, settling into the house that was once her refuge, Mrs. Emily finds herself crying silently in her room, feeling as though the walls that once protected her are now closing in around her, feeling worthless and trapped, like an old piece of furniture that no one appreciates, but no one dares to throw away. How many elders are there who live this drama in silence? In search of family warmth, the paradox is cruel. Mrs. Emily has lost the fire of her own identity where it should be. Intimacy, BAL, has become an invisible cage. How can we get out of this trap? Is there a way to regain our independence without letting go of our family? Dear philosopher Bertrand Russell once said that the meaning of life is not just physical, but also mental and spiritual growth. But how can Mrs. Emily grow when she feels herself getting smaller every day in her own home? Get ready to find out how a lifelong friend changed Mrs. Emily's life with advice that calls into question everything we think we know about aging and family. It was a day like any other when Carmela, Mrs. Emily's lifelong friend, decided to pay her a surprise visit with her characteristic smile and a bag full of freshly baked cookies. Ms. Carmela rang the doorbell, but was speechless when she saw what was on the other side of the door. "Emily, you seem different," Carmela exclaimed, noticing the bags on her friend's face and the tired look on her face. Mrs. Emily invited them in with a forced smile, sipping coffee in the kitchen while trying to hide her tiredness. Ms. Carmela couldn't help but notice that her friend's usually clean house was unusually messy. "Are you okay, Emily? You seem a little off the beaten path," she asked with genuine concern. Then the floodgates opened like a river overflowing. Mrs. Emily began to confess everything: her tiredness, her frustrations, her emotions, in a life she no longer recognized as her own. "You know, Carmela, sometimes I feel like I've lost my essence. I'm not Emily anymore. I'm just a grandma now," she tearfully confessed. "I love my grandchildren. But where did the woman who dreamed of traveling and reading novels until dawn go?" When Emily finished venting her anger, Sela listened intently and nodded in understanding. Her friend took her hand and with a knowing smile said, "Emily, darling, what if I told you that I went through the same thing and found a solution that changed my life?" Mrs. Emily rolled her eyes and replied incredulously, "You always seem so happy and free." Carmela laughed. "Oh, but it wasn't always like that. Remember when my kids convinced me to move in with them? 6 months later, I realized I was making the biggest mistake of my life." So Carmela started to tell him about her experience. Just like Emily, she had lost her independence, her hobbies, her essence. But one day, she continued, "I remembered the words of philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson. You can only be what you want to be." And Mrs. Emily listened with fascination as Carmela told her how she had succeeded. A courageous decision to move into her own apartment. It wasn't easy. Carmela admitted that my children couldn't understand at first. But how about it? Over time, our relationship improved. They no longer saw me as a burden or a constant babysitter, but as a mother, an independent and happy woman. But Carmela got in their way. "Emily, didn't you feel lonely sometimes?" Carmela smiled at times, of course, but as psychologist Carl Jung says, loneliness is not lonely. The lack of people around you does not come from loneliness, but rather from not being able to communicate what seems important. I want to tell Emily, I said that since I regained my independence, my conversations with my children and grandchildren have become richer and more meaningful. Carmela's words resonated with me. Deeply connected with Emily, it was like someone had turned on a light in a dark room and revealed a path that I didn't know existed. True happiness comes from living alone while maintaining a healthy balance between family responsibilities and self-care. Have recent studies found that older adults who maintain their independence are mentally and physically healthier? Emily shook her head, interested in this new information. Carmela explained that a study published in the Journal of Gerontology found that older adults who live independently had higher life satisfaction and less depression. In fact, a stronger immune system. Mrs. Emily was silent for a moment as she processed everything she had just heard. And finally, in a voice laced with fear, she asked, "But Carrera, how do I start? I'm afraid of hurting my daughter and grandchildren." Before we continue with the story, if you liked the video, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe with a bell. That way you won't miss any future videos. Also, if you like this type of content as much as I do, please comment. By the way, I love these kinds of stories. Also, comment on what you want to see in the next video. I read all of your comments. Let's continue to learn together and improve our lives. Carrera clasped her hands lovingly. "Emily, my love, real love is not possessive. Your children will like you more when they see you happy. Start with small steps. Why not join the painting class you've always wanted to take? Go for a walk alone in the morning with cold coffee, hands and a heart full of new hope. Gradually reclaim your space." Mrs. Emily faced a challenge she never imagined. She considered her situation and valued her independence. Carmela's unexpected visit brought him not only cookies, but also the seeds of a new life. Mrs. Emily was at a crossroads of emotions. While she loved her family dearly, she felt her decline as a person. She remembered the words of the philosopher Seneca, "Life is long if you know how to use it." And she wondered if she was really using her life or just existing. One morning, while making breakfast for her grandchildren, she had an epiphany that reminded her of her passion, painting, which she had given up years ago. When was the last time she held a brush? I couldn't remember the day. That same day, she decided to take a small step towards her independence. It started with something simple, a lonely walk in the park. At first, she felt guilty for not being at home, for helping, but soon she realized that those daily moments of solitude were important. Like an oasis in the desert, Emily began to think about her forgotten dreams and plan how to find them again. Her next step was even more daring. She attended a painting workshop for seniors at a community center. She wondered what I would do if I could no longer paint. But as the famous painter Pablo Picasso said, "Inspiration exists, but it must be found at work," and she found it in her studio. Not only did Lady Emily discover her passion for art, she also made new friends among the brushstrokes and laughs. She realized that she had been living on autopilot, forgetting that life is full of possibilities no matter how old you are. A Harvard University study showed that maintaining independence as you age not only improves your mental health, but it can also increase your life expectancy by up to 5 years. Mrs. Emily showed us living proof of this with every new activity or personal decision. I felt rejuvenated, but not everything was rosy. There were days when she was overwhelmed with guilt. "Am I selfish?" she asked herself. At that moment, she remembered a wise person, advice from her friend Carmela. "You can't pour from an empty cup. It's not selfish to take care of yourself. You needed to keep taking care of others." When Mrs. Emily regained her independence, she noticed amazing changes. Her energy increased, chronic pain subsided, her memory improved. Even with Dr. Oliver Sacks, the famous neurologist and author, often said that the brain is the most amazing organ, adapting, changing and reshaping with every new experience. Mrs. Emily remade her brain and her life with every new adventure, but the most significant changes happened to her brain. Paradoxically, by spending less time with her family, her relationships with them became more valuable and meaningful. She was no longer a tired and nagging grandmother, but a bright woman with important, interesting stories to tell. Mrs. Emily finally used all her courage to have an important conversation with her daughter. She knew it would not be easy, but she also knew that it was necessary, because as the poet Maya Angelou once said, "There is no greater pain than having an untold story," and Mrs. Emily also had a lot to say to her. Mrs. Emily took a deep breath, sat down in front of her daughter Lucia, and without imagining what was about to happen, she said in a trembling voice, "I have started thinking about a lot of things lately. Mrs. Emily, I think it's about time you moved to your own apartment." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucia blinked several times, trying to understand what she had just heard. But Mama Lucia stammered, "Why don't you do that? You feel comfortable here. Did we do something wrong?" Concern mixed with guilt was evident in her voice. Mrs. Emily smiled gently. "No, my darling, you were wonderful, but I need to read a book of self-discovery to have my own space." She thought of the words of philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. man is condemned to be free, and at the age of 70, she has chosen this freedom. Lucia's reaction was a mix of surprise, confusion, sadness, and understanding. "But Mom, can you get over it on your own? What if she gets sick?" "Will you?" she asked, her eyes full of concern. Mrs. Emily took her daughter's hand. "Look, Lucia, I'm not saying I'm going to disappear. I just want to have more space and enjoy this stage of my life." She recalled of a University of Michigan study that showed that older adults who maintain their independence report higher levels of life satisfaction. "Are you here?" Lucia countered, clinging to every reason she could think of. Mrs. Emily smiled. "I love being with them, but how about you? I think I'd be a better grandma if I had my own time." As a writer, Morrow Lindbergh once said that the highest joy of a human being is to be loved, but to be loved freely and with will. Lucia was silent for a while, taking in everything her mother had told her. Finally, she nodded with tears in her eyes. "You're right, Mom. We're going to miss you so much, and I miss you too," Mrs. Emily replied, embracing her daughter. "But think of all the delicious food I'll make when you come to visit without telling anyone that I use too much salt." They both laughed, breaking the tension of the moment. Family psychologist Dr. Maria Elena Rodriguez points out that these conversations are difficult but essential to maintaining healthy relationships between parents and their adult children. Open and honest communication can strengthen family bonds, even if it means big changes, she said. As the conversation continued, Lucia began to see things from a mother's perspective. "We all need our own space, and so do you. You've spent years taking care of us." Mrs. Emily nodded in appreciation of her daughter's accurate understanding. "And now, as the poet said to her roommate yesterday, I want to take care of myself. Because I was smart, I wanted to change the world today. Because I'm smart, I'm going to change myself." Lucia smiled, a mixture of pride and nostalgia in her eyes. "So I thought, Mom, we need to help you find the perfect apartment with a kitchen big enough for all of our secret recipes and a balcony for my kids." Mrs. Emily added plants to her. The day Mrs. Emily stepped over the threshold of her new apartment, she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Am I doing the right thing?" she asked herself. But, as psychologist Carl Jung once said, "I'm not. What happened to me is what I am, and what I want to be." And so Mrs. Emily decided to take the plunge and set up a new home, which turned out to be an unexpected therapy. Every object she placed was an affirmation of her identity. She had always liked the colorful carpet, but her daughter felt it was too striking with the paintings by her favorite artist that now hung on the walls. She dared to paint one wall brightly. She painted a turquoise picture. "Oh, if my Ramon could see me now," she would laugh at the memory of her late husband. But Mrs. Emily's real rebirth began when she dared to step out of her comfort zone. How wonderful it was to sign up for a gardening workshop on plants and grandmothers at the community center. A combination of cliches. There she met Mrs. Consuelo, a widow with a scathing sense of humor, and they soon became accomplices in a common adventure. They discovered the concept of active aging, which was not just about staying busy, but about living purposefully. As they did, the World Health Organization announced active aging, which allows people to achieve their potential for physical, social, and mental well-being throughout their lives. Mrs. Emily and Mrs. Consuelo decided to take yoga classes. The first class was a bizarre disaster. "I felt like a bad one. Pretzel." Mrs. Emily joked, but they persisted and soon noticed an improvement in their flexibility and balance. More importantly, one day over coffee after class, they laughed as if years hadn't happened. "Emily," Mrs. Consuelo said to her, "Emily, have you noticed that we have stopped complaining about complaints?" Indeed, they were so busy living that they forgot about getting older. The Roman philosopher Seneca once said that life is like a play. What matters is not how long it lasts, but how well it is performed. Mrs. Emily was determined that the second act would be the best one. She took even more courage and joined a book club where she rediscovered her love of poetry. She even dared to write her own poems, something she hadn't done since her youth. "Wrinkles on paper are less noticeable than on my face," she joked to her new friends. But the biggest change was in her relationship with her family. Paradoxically, having her own space made visits by her children and grandchildren more special. They were no longer an obligation, but a shared joy. One Sunday, when her eldest daughter helped her water the plants on her small balcony, Mrs. Emily had a fundamental realization. Not only had she regained her independence, but she was also teaching the younger generation a valuable lesson about growing old beautifully and joyfully. The paradox of love teaches us that distance is sometimes the secret ingredient that strengthens the most important bonds. When his wife Emily decided to move into her own apartment, many thought she had made a mistake. "How can you be alone at this age?" they said to her, but she replied with a mischievous smile, "I'm alone now. I have a more social life than an influencer." She did not exaggerate the physical distance between Mrs. Emily and her family. Like a rubber band, the bond grew stronger with a slight stretch. The grandchildren's visits were eagerly awaited. In the afternoon, adventures in front of the TV were no longer monotonous, but expeditions full of laughter and discoveries. One day the grandchildren arrived at their house and found their grandmother in the middle of a huge canvas. "Grandma, you look like Picasso, little Matto," they called. Mrs. Emily replied with paint up to her eyebrows. "What's wrong? Picasso is too small for me, I am, Big Emily." That afternoon, between brushstrokes and laughs, they created a family masterpiece that now proudly hangs in the living room. But it was not just a visit. The improved phone conversations, which were previously routine and short, turned into long and drawn-out ones. As psychologist K.L. Rogers says, meaningful conversations. Good communicators listen not only with their ears, but also with their eyes and hearts, and that is exactly what happened in Mrs. Emily's family. Mrs. Emily's independence had a ripple effect on the whole family when she saw her daughter Lucia, who was so independent and happy, confess to my mother, and it inspired me to return to my dream. Freedom turns out to be contagious, and Mrs. Emily's example sowed the seeds of change in all her loved ones. A University of Michigan study found that older adults who maintain their independence have higher mental health. Mrs. Emily reports greater life satisfaction and better family relationships. The study and her experience during an afternoon coffee with friends led her to question stereotypes about aging. "Mrs. Emily reminded me of you. I thought love meant staying together forever. Now I understand that true love gives room to grow." Her words resonated with the wisdom of poet Khalil Gibran, who wrote, "Leave space in your connection." The paradox of love that Mrs. Emily discovered is that sometimes we need to move apart to truly get closer. The philosopher Eric once said that mature love means, "I need you because I love you, not I love you because I need you." Mrs. Emily moved from a suffocating dependent relationship to a healthy, interdependent love. This new family relationship benefited everyone, not just Mrs. Emily involved. Her grandchildren now had 2 loving homes. The children felt less pressured and more grateful, and Mrs. Emily thrived in her new life. It was as if she had found the secret recipe for a happy family. Ironically, the main ingredient was a little distant. Mrs. Emily realized that the key was not to be with either of them. The children's lives were still completely isolated, but in an unexpected place between the 2 extremes. As the Greek philosopher Aristotle said, "Virtue lies in the middle," and Mrs. Emily saw it firsthand after her courageous decision to regain her enlightenment and independence. A new dilemma: how to maintain close relationships with her family without sacrificing her newfound freedom. As is often the case with life's great truths, the answer was simple, but not easy. Balance. Mrs. Emily learned that the key was healthy interdependence, an American concept that psychologist Stephen Seavey described as a synthesis of independence and dependence. But in reality, this meant setting clear but flexible boundaries for Mrs. Emily. For example, she agreed to babysit her grandchildren 2 afternoons a week, but reserved the rest of the time for her own activities. It's a juggling act she always joked about, but I love the freedom and responsibility instead of the balance ball. This new approach had an amazing impact on the quality of time she spent with her family. It was no longer endless, mundane hours, but special moments full of laughter and real connection. As an author, Mitch Albom once said that death is not the end of relationships, but the end of life. Mrs. Emily understood that strengthening relationships depends on the quality of time, not the quantity. But the journey was not without challenges. There were days when guilt threatened to return like a dark cloud. On a sunny day, at that moment, Mrs. Emily remembered the words of psychologist Carl Jung: "What you deny makes you submissive. What you accept changes you." So instead of denying her feelings, she accepted them and used them as an opportunity to strengthen her resolve. A University of Michigan study found that seniors who maintained a balance between independence and family support were 30% less likely to suffer from depression. Emily was living proof of this statistic. Using new balance not only made her happier, but healthier over time. She was something of a guru to her friends in the senior support group she attended, sharing her experiences with humor and wisdom. As her dear friend would often say, "Age is like a good wine. It needs room to breathe, but also the warmth of good company to bring out its full flavor." As anthropologist Margaret Mee once said, it has caused many to rethink their own family relationships. Committed citizens can change the world. In fact, they are the only ones who have ever done so, and in their little world, Mrs. Emily changed things, one family at a time. But perhaps the most important change was in Mrs. Emily herself, who no longer saw herself as what she was, a burden to her family or a figurehead life. She was, as philosopher Seneca would say, a woman with dreams and goals, with the energy to pursue them. We are not losing too much time. We are losing too much. And Mrs. Emily was determined not to. Mrs. Emily's story shows how an act of self-love can transform not only a life, but an entire family. When Mrs. Emily decided to regain her independence, she not only did something good for herself, she sowed a seed. As psychologist Carl Jung once said, "The greatest influence we can have on our children is not what we teach them, but how we live our own lives to the fullest." As Mrs. Emily said, her family wisdom said her courage had a ripple effect on her. Her daughter, who was hesitant at first, also began to see her mother with new eyes. She was no longer just a grandmother, but a woman with her own dreams and passions. This prompted her to rethink her life and ask herself if she was living it the way she wanted. Her grandchildren, in turn, saw their eyes light up when Mrs. Emily showed them her new paintings or told them about her adventures in the art studio. And unwittingly, they learned a valuable lesson about the importance of independence and the value of society. The importance of never stopping to grow, but Mrs. Emily's legacy extends beyond her immediate family. Her story invites us all to reflect on our own family relationships. Do we respect the personal space of our loved ones, or are we unintentionally suffocating them with our own expectations? Philosopher Khalil Gibran once said, "Mrs. Emily, your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of the life they want for themselves." Mrs. Emily realized that the same is true for parents. We are not the property of our children. We are individuals with a right to our own life. Dear viewers, I invite you to ask yourself, will you live your own life or the life others expect of you? If you want to do this bike tour, remember that it is never too late to start over. Do it And don't forget to invite me, okay? Life is too short to live in fear. Let's get out of our comfort zone and do something that scares us sometimes. This is how we grow and learn, as the greats say. Anything you can do or dream of, you can achieve. In boldness lies the power of genius and magic. So be brave and be yourself. The best gift you can give your family is your own happiness. If you made it this far, write in the comments. Water is powerful, so we will see who the winner is who reaches the end of the video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more content like this in the future. Share this video with your loved ones to put this wisdom into practice today, and consider becoming a member and supporting the channel. In this way, not only will you contribute financially, but you will also enjoy special benefits. I will leave a link in the pinned comment, so please take a look. Thank you for your support. Click on this video now and continue to nourish your mind with wisdom. Big hugs and see you again soon.